From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will be in to discuss sulfur deficiencies in wheat stands, how those impact wheat productivity, how to identify them, and the best fertilization options for correcting them. Also today from the Farm Analyst program at K-State, Duane Hund. We'll talk about some of the financial situations he's encountering as he works with Kansas farm families here at the end of 2020. He reminds about how this program can help family farms overcome their operations' financial challenges. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton on wintertime protection of young landscape trees. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
It's good to have you aboard once again for another Agriculture Today. You crop producers and more directly you wheat growers, we've some thoughts for you to consider about sulfur deficiency potential in your stands. And we've welcomed back by once again Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Well, sulfur is one of those elements that probably takes a back seat to other fertility considerations like nitrogen and phosphorus. But especially in wheat, you say, Dorivar, we're seeing this deficiency issue pop up in more places around Kansas.
Yes, Eric, it's a nutrient deficiency that's becoming more common in parts of the state. Again, it is a secondary nutrient, so like you say, may not get the attention of the macronutrients, but there are many reasons for the deficiency to start developing. Historically, we tend to get significant amounts of sulfur from atmospheric deposition. We don't get much of that anymore at this point with clean air, and so that's one of the reasons. But also we have to keep in mind that the main source of sulfur from the soil tends to be organic matter, and so anything affecting soil organic matter will also be affecting the supply of sulfur to the crops. And so again, we tend to see it quite often in sandy soils, and so those are the first places where we tend to see it. Low organic matter soils, sandy soils where, again, we may have some leaching. We have to remember that sulfur is mobile in the soil, and so if we do have conditions for leaching, we may actually see significant leaching happening for sulfur. So again, in that kind of situation, we may tend to see more deficiency problems. We also see pretty commonly in areas where we have some level of erosion, where, again, organic matter is low, and so side slopes, it's not uncommon to see that deficiency develop. So it can vary quite a bit in some fields, a lot of it depending on those factors of organic matter, erosion, and so on.
And in more fine-textured soils now, then this gets to the geographic nature of the problem, you say.
Yes, and that's one of the things we have to keep in mind. Again, initially we talk primarily about sandy soils, but nowadays, also because we are seeing, of course, higher yields and uptake of sulfur, of course, can be quite significant. Then if we're not supplying sulfur either by sources of fertilizer, then, of course, we're going to start to see deficiency. And so we start to see deficiency develops even in fine texture soils. So that's a very good point, and we need to keep in mind, again, if we are thinking about our entire fertility program, and if we are not supplying sulfur somehow, then we're starting to see problems developing in all kinds of soil types.
Well, our attention today is mostly on wheat, Dorivar, but other crops, particularly corn, can exhibit symptoms of the sulfur deficiency.
Yes, that's very important to keep in mind. Again, the most sensitive crop tends to be wheat, but again, we start to see more and more developing in corn as well. Alfalfa is another crop that typically can be sensitive to sulfur deficiency, and it's a big user of sulfur in general. So again, those are the target crops. Also, you're mentioning deficiency seen symptoms. And I'll just want to touch on that a little bit because sulfur deficiency can be very similar to nitrogen. And this is one thing that I often see. And unless you get in very close and look at some of the specific characteristics, sometimes we may confuse actually nitrogen deficiency and sulfur deficiency. And so that's a challenge. And I would say most producers nowadays are more familiar with sulfur deficiency, but some years ago, what some people will do is maybe add more nitrogen when in reality what we need is sulfur. And again, some of the key differences are where that yellow color develops. And if you're looking at corn, the same for winter wheat, you tend to see that chlorosis basically happening in the upper leaves. That's the opposite of nitrogen. In nitrogen, you tend to see it more in the lower leaves, of course. But again, those are things that you have to maybe examine things a little bit closer, but looking at from a distance, especially in winter wheat, nitrogen and sulfur could look very similar.
When those symptoms express themselves, though, it'll be normally later on approaching green-up time? Yes,
and that's really when we tend to see the problems once the winter wheat start growing in the spring and we see green up. That's typically the time when we start to see more problems. And there are many reasons for that. Obviously, the crops start growing and taking up more nutrients, and suddenly we are maybe short of sulfur. But also, in the case of winter wheat, one of the challenges is that, again, in the soil we have organic and inorganic form of sulfur, and we do need to have some mineralization happening from organic matter, basically to release available sulfur. And so in the springtime, with low temperatures in the soil, especially dry years, and so far it's been quite dry in parts of the state. If we continue this way, obviously the low moisture and combined with low temperature may reduce the mineralization of sulfur, and again, creating some of that deficiency symptom happening in the spring.
So then, it would be of benefit for producers if they suspect that they have a sulfur deficiency concern out there to test for it yet here in the wintertime?
Yes, it is a good time now to collect samples, especially as we're thinking about top dressing for winter wheat. That would be the ideal time to do this application. So now is the time to be thinking about our top dressing program. What are we thinking in terms of nutrients? And definitely try to get some samples. Now, I mentioned that sulfur is a mobile nutrient in the soil, so we need to get a profile sample. One thing that's very particular about sulfur, and I want to emphasize this, is that we may have some significant accumulation of sulfur lower in the profile, especially if we have some clay layers. And so it's not uncommon that we may get a 0 to 6 inch sample and sulfur may come back deficient, but then if we are collecting at 18 or 24 inches, we find out that we have plenty of sulfur in the lower profile. So we really need to have that profile sampling if we can for sulfur, which again, it is a mobile nutrient, and we have this accumulation happening in clay layers.
And even if that sulfur layer is a little deeper, the wheat eventually can access that? Hopefully.
Yes, and this is a very good question because obviously we do tend to have more shallow roots early on in the spring, and sometimes we may see just slight deficiency in that kind of situation early on, but as soon as we have more growth, the roots get to that and the wheat basically grow out of that. So it's not uncommon that we'll tend to see some mild deficiencies maybe just very early, but until the roots get to it. You know, if we know we have this kind of situation, what many people will do is also consider some starter fertilizer and be able to have at least small amounts near the seeds early. Obviously, we have to make that decision at planting time, but if we're thinking about corn in particular, is where we typically will recommend that, to have some sulfur with the starter for corn.
Well, on selecting a sulfur fertilizer source for wheat, there are two possibilities: dry formulations, liquid formulations. What's out there and what should producers be thinking about as they do choose?
This is a very important point because sulfur is a little bit different than your NP and K, where we know, the formulation you get that's going to be plant available. In the case of sulfur, we have elemental sulfur and we have sulfate. And this is the first thing we need to keep in mind. And elemental sulfur basically needs some time for that sulfur to oxidize and become plant available. Remember, plants basically take up sulfur in the sulfate form. And so, again, that's the first thing we need to keep in mind. And then we have, like you say, we have dry and liquids. From the dries, we have elemental sulfur, which, again, we do need more time for that to become available. So if we choose to use elemental sulfur in application during these winter months, for example, that would be ideal for corn. For winter wheat, we're not going to get the benefit of that elemental sulfur anymore. And so we really need to be looking at some sulfate forms. And so what we have in terms of dry sulfate, ammonium sulfate is a common one. Of course, we do get the nitrogen with that as well, fertilizer-grade ammonium sulfate. And so, again, that's one that can be used for dry source. There are other things like gypsum, calcium sulfate, that is also a good source of sulfur that we can use basically at this point, and that will be available to the crop, essentially. In terms of dry fertilizer, there are also more and more of these combinations of NP and K commercial products that basically have a mix of phosphorus that bring some sulfur and some zinc, and those are good options. Those are typically tends to be used primarily pre-plant, and so right now maybe not the best option anymore. And then we go to the liquids, and the liquids, especially we're using UAN for top dressing nitrogen. Those are good options. Primarily, basically, we're talking ammonium thiosulfate, ATS, and there's also some use of potassium thiosulfate, KTS, but definitely ammonium thiosulfate tends to be the most popular one. Thiosulfate can be blended with UAN. That way, you're basically providing your nitrogen and sulfur at top dressing time. And again, it's an excellent source for that application. Again, these are going to be all immediately available, and that's the good thing about all of these sulfate sources, especially the liquids that, again, if we're doing UAN applications, that would be the right time to do it.
Again, Dorivar, it's about making sure that you need sulfur for that wheat crop currently.
Absolutely. We need to start with testing, see what we have out there, and then based on the timing and the situation, we need to choose the right product as well.
Producers, you can check out the latest Agronomy E-Update newsletter out of K-State, which has an article on this very matter, sulfur deficiency in wheat. Take a look at agronomy.ksu.edu. That edition was dated Friday, December the 4th. Dorivar, as always, thanks for being by.
Thank you.
He's a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. And we'll return shortly on this Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. Once more, we want to inform farmers and ranchers across the state of Kansas of a special and important service that's been provided for several decades now out of the Agricultural Economics Department here at Kansas State University. It's called the Farm Analyst Program. Its longtime director is across the way now to talk of the state of affairs in Kansas production agriculture as we transition very soon into the new year 2021. Duane Hund is with us. Duane, thanks for joining us once more. We like to get together on an annual basis about this time and get a sense of what's happening out there as you visit with farm families about their financial circumstances. It's been a strange year, hasn't it?
Oh, yes, definitely. But one thing's for sure, change is inevitable, and we're going to have more. I've never seen a demand-led rally like in soybeans act the way it did from a pretty solid $8 mark. Now we're up over $11, and a lot of us sold too soon, but we still ended up doing okay. It's been quite a year. Livestock production, different things have happened there, and then all of these government payments are really, it's going to take just a little bit of pencil pushing to see where we're at.
Remind listeners of what Farm Analyst is and what it provides, if you would.
The Farm Analyst program started in the mid-'80s as a way of having trained farmers, agriculture producers, work with other producers to find a way to get them to survive and grow and prosper. In many cases, when we go in and use a program called FinPack, which is a computer program that does an excellent job of plotting a new course and a roadmap for us to go to, it enables us to break down by enterprise each of the things the farm is doing. Enterprises, of course, can be different crop mixes and different livestock enterprises, but separate them out and try to help that producer find out which of those is the most profitable for them, what do they have the best resources to work with, and can we do less of the things that aren't working as well and do more of the things that are and see what our profitability projections might be. It's amazing to me over the years, and I've done over several thousand of these, that it inevitably is a very worthwhile task to spend 4 to 5 or 6 hours and put these numbers together. It's a real important job to do the planning as we go forward each year.
Duane, you work with individual operations, individual family farms, as do your colleagues, your fellow analysts within the program. But as you look back on 2020 and these various influences on the farm financial situation, are there common threads that you see around Kansas?
Well, the common threads are that we're in a vast unknown with this pandemic going on. It's been really hard to know what to expect from one month to the next. Things are pretty stable now, it seems like. It have been probably since August, much more stable than they were prior to that. There were times last spring when nobody knew what to do with a set of heifers that were ready to go to a feedlot. Do I sell them? Do I take a loss or do I put them in there and retain ownership? For example, that was just some of the questions that I got. And it's really hard when you're in an environment like we were in that's unprecedented to know what to do. But even at that, planning and orchestrating some type of a solution is better than not doing anything and letting things just take care of themselves, which isn't the best policy at all. We know that from our own operations. Each of our farm analysts are actively producing, either farming or have livestock or both, and they're down in the trenches the same as our family farms are that we work with. And without question, we endure, but we try to pass on to these families we work with the things we've learned from other families' successes and make them have the ability to be more competitive and do things better if we can help them figure that out.
So amidst this stability, what are those things that generally producers need to assess, examine, and contemplate as they're looking ahead to 2021, do you think?
Well, without question, it really starts with what is it you want to do that is most important to you. If you really like cows, then we need to work on expanding the cow herd. If you just love raising crops and that's your first passion, then we need to concentrate on that. So the first step is to really figure out what you're here for and what is it that motivates you most. After we do that, then the next step is what are the resources we have to make that happen. I've had several cases where a son starts in with dad and the operation is his successor, and the son is really orientated towards cows, for instance. But they live in an area where grass is short to come by. It's hard to rent. They have to truck their cattle quite a ways to find enough pasture land, and it's a struggle for them. So it's a matter of assessing what the pros and cons are and trying to not only match the passion of the farm family and what they like to do, but also figure out how they can make it more profitable. As we go forth and look at the resources, then the next step is to build a business plan. And I like to do this on a year-by-year basis with a goal in mind of what's our 3 to 5 year goal. What do we want this thing to look like down the road a ways? Then we end up doing the things necessary each year to achieve what that long-range goal is. And I work with families to do goal setting and also to write them down. And one of the things I really like to do is have them develop a mission statement. What is the mission of this operation? What are we striving to be? And then after they get that written, I challenge them to go get it printed up nicely at some place that does that, and then post it above their door as they walk in and out of the shop. And not only they see it, but their employees see it, and they get a sense of what we're about. What is it we're going to try to achieve, and how are we doing it?
Many things to think about and to remind. The Farm Analyst program and those that represent it stand ready to facilitate those very processes, right?
Absolutely. As we get working with farm families on a year-to-year basis, we also come down to some things that aren't always easy to talk about right at the first time. And that involves succession planning, but which also necessitates something to do with planning when the matriarch and patriarch are no longer here. So estate planning is crucial. I've done a lot of that over the years with families I've worked with to enable the next generation to be successful. As I've said many times, to enable a farmer to enjoy his retirement, he needs to educate his successor well. We don't always do that, and it's to our detriment if we don't educate those people and mentor them as they come along the ranks and give them the help from the management standpoint, not write them a check, but give them help directly and influence them. Let them make mistakes. It's going to happen. But as one farmer told me many years ago I was visiting with, he said, well, I figured this out. I'll let my son go far enough that he skins his knees, but I won't let him go so far that he breaks his legs.
Well put. And the Farm Analyst service, to remind, is confidential. It's one-on-one with an operation, and you're accommodating that even with our pandemic protocols, Duane?
We are. It's amazing how many farm families are using Zoom now just from their own purposes to get keyed in on things that they want to be educated about, and also to use it to talk with other family members, and how the distances have just narrowed so quickly. It's not the same as being in the same room, but it's close. Yeah, we value confidentiality, very important. We want to help farm families. We don't want them to be stigmatized in any way, and we're very cautious about that. Our fees are very reasonable for what we do for them, and no farm family that is in need is turned away because they can't pay. So the Kansas Ag Mediation Service gives us about 50% of our referrals every year, and then the rest of them come from county agents and different people who we've worked with before that spread the word that we're here to help.
You can contact Duane or colleagues at Farm Analyst through the Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services at 1-800-321-3276. That's 800-321-FARM. Or check out the link to the program at the agmanager.info website. Before we let you go, we want to note, Duane, that you are very soon hanging it up after 36 years as the director of the Farm Analyst program out of Kansas State University. So it is a momentous occasion. You were right there at the outset of the program, instrumental in making it happen. And its track record has spoken for itself over the years in the state, as it has helped hundreds and hundreds of farm families navigate the difficulties to better solutions for them. Your commitment to this has been unwavering, no matter how demanding it might have been. And we know in our visits right here that demanding was more often than not an understatement. So a hearty thanks for the yeoman service, and all the best to you in pursuing that next thing, whatever it might be. Duane, congratulations.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Duane Hund, who will soon be retiring as the director of the Farm Analyst program out of the Agricultural Economics Department at Kansas State University. Again, we'd part with reminding you about the service, and you can look into it a couple of ways. Go to agmanager.info or call the Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services office at 1-800-321-FARM, 1-800-321-3276. Agriculture Today returns with today's agricultural news headlines, the Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi, and our K-State horticulture feature for the week. Still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and continuing on now with today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Bloomberg is reporting this week that, measured by the bushel, the U.S.-China grain trade relationship has never been stronger. Hog producers in China and crop producers in the U.S. have become increasingly interdependent. Already America's largest customer of soybeans and sorghum, China, has recently bought an unprecedented 11.2 million metric tons of corn. That's up nearly 1,300% compared with pre-trade war purchases. The American imports have helped China feed that hog herd, which is recovering faster than expected after the African swine fever outbreak that created shortages of that country's most staple protein. Meanwhile, U.S. farm incomes are at a 7-year high, riding China's demand and additional support from federal aid. In fact, U.S. trade numbers from the USDA for October show huge percentage increases from October 2019 sales in U.S. farm products to China overall. The USDA's Gary Crawford has more.
USDA economist and trade tracker Bart Ketter says if you look at the U.S. ag sales to China this past October, the value is
$4.8 billion. An increase of 316% over the October 2019 value.
Wow, and if you break that down to commodities, the percentages are even higher. For example,
exports of wheat were up 364% to China, and soybeans were up 412%, and exports of cotton was up 731% to China.
And in what Kenner calls
a bit of a ridiculous number,
corn sales to China this October were up by how much?
188,000%.
Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Still, the current deeper reliance on the China market may be tenuous. Tom Vilsack, who's expected to become the next USDA secretary, is emphasizing the risks. He's warning that American agriculture has to be careful of putting too many eggs in the China basket. He said he thinks the lesson that should be learned from the last couple of years is the need for American agriculture to continue to diversify, so there's always somewhere else to go for our products other than the storage bins. The Trump administration has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to deny an appeal made by refining companies to review an appeals court decision on the EPA's small refinery exemptions program. In a brief filed with the Supreme Court on Tuesday, the U.S. Department of Justice said the refiners Holly Frontier and CVR Energy have not proven a conflict of law. In January, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit in Denver ruled that the EPA did not have the authority to issue renewable fuel standard small refinery exemption extensions to 3 companies that were not originally granted waivers. The 2 refiners appealing to the Supreme Court have alleged the 10th Circuit ruling puts them at a competitive disadvantage to other refiners. Now, Congress provided a temporary exemption for small refiners that could extend beyond 2010 based on a U.S. Department of Energy study or an EPA determination of disproportionate economic hardship on a case-by-case basis. The EPA granted 85 small refinery exemptions between 2016 and 2018, totaling more than 4 billion ethanol-equivalent gallons not blended with petroleum. The agency currently has 41 exemption requests pending for the 19 and 20 compliance period. Coming your way next, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update, and with that is Greg Akagi. Greg?
We're joined now by Jim Sutter, who is the CEO of the U.S. Soybean Export Council. And Jim, as we look at the marketing of U.S. soy, you have to look at China at number 1, but you also have other opportunities across that region as well.
China's obviously very important, and we've had a long-term relationship there, but we don't want to be only dependent upon one market. So we are working in several different places around the world to diversify the portfolio, if you will. You know, Southeast Asia is an important area, and we've been working there for some time, and we continue to see the fruits of those labors with places like Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, all growing markets and important markets for U.S. soy. A place where we've been working, but we're really starting to see some success now. And this would be in markets like Bangladesh and Pakistan. These are places where a few years ago their imports were quite small, but they've really been growing because of growing activities in their poultry industry, growing consumption of poultry by their population, and aquaculture as well, especially in a country like Bangladesh. Both of those countries have created soybean crushing industries, so they were both in the top 10 of our U.S. soy imports this past year.
Another way that you help that international customer is through the Dare to Compare campaign as well.
We're just launching this campaign, and what we're really asking people to do is dig into the details, study the data of U.S. soy compared to soy from other origins, because we believe strongly. We wouldn't ask them to do that if we hadn't done our homework. We've done it, and we know that when they look at the nutritional bundle of U.S. soy, the amino acid profile, the energy levels, and just the overall composition of U.S. soy, they'll see it's a superior ingredient in feed rations. Likewise, if they look at the oil and look at the refinability and the way that the impurities that are left in oil after it's crushed and before it goes to a refinery, they'll see that the U.S. has a superior situation there. And finally, the sustainability of U.S. soy, which is an issue becoming much, much more interesting for people around the world. And I think maybe COVID-19 is driving that. People are asking more questions about where does my food come from? How is it produced? And I tell you, the U.S. has a great history and a great marketing message in terms of the sustainable production that our U.S. soy farmers do such a great job in producing U.S. soy for us to export to the world.
That is Jim Sutter, CEO of the U.S. Soybean Export Council, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. Greg Akagi there. And we've a somber note to pass along. Former longtime dean of Kansas State University's Polytechnic campus, Dennis Kuhlman, passed away on Monday due to complications of COVID. Dennis served as the leader of the Salina campus from 1997 until his retirement in 2012. Now, his name will ring familiar to you longtime listeners. Before joining K-State Salina, Dennis was an extension pesticide application engineer here on the Manhattan campus. He joined K-State in that capacity in 1977, that is. He worked with hundreds of you farmers and agricultural vendors for the next 20 years before departing for that Salina campus post. He grew up on a family farm near Lakin in southwest Kansas, and he was 72 years old as his passing. Our deepest condolences to his wife, Carol, and the entire Kuhlman family. Great leader, exemplary Kansan. This is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so stay a minimum of 6 feet away from others and stay home if you can. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Agriculture Today continues now. It's our time to talk horticultural matters once more. This time, we'll turn to Research and Extension Horticulture Agent in Johnson County, Dennis Patton. And Dennis will talk about wintertime landscape and fruit tree protection. Yes, it's the off-season, but those trees can be vulnerable to any number of damaging situations, including, we'll start with this, possible rodent damage.
Yeah, and that tender young bark on our trees just happens to be loaded with sugar and carbohydrates and everything good that they like. We normally see the vole and rabbit damage on younger, tender bark trees. Once the tree gets what I call that corkiness to it, that more textured look to it, that thicker bark, usually they're not a problem. So these are trees that are relatively young. Now, in fruit trees, that could be 4 or 5 years or more down, because fruit trees usually always have a fairly thin bark. Tends to be more on those lighter colored barks maybe they'll feed on. But it's kind of one of those things that's better safe to be sorry, because in the sorry world, there's not much you can do recourse to take care of it. So it's better to get out there, prevent the damage, than to find it and go, uh-oh, now what do I do? Because there's not a lot you can do.
Right. And the damage in and of itself, before we talk about that protection, that feeding will interfere with the tree or shrub's ability to translocate important nutrients.
Correct. So what they do is, if you go back to your kind of basic high school botany, is they cut through what's called the cambium layer. So the cambium layer is that live layer of tissue that with the xylem and phloem that conducts the water and nutrients up and down the tree. And once you sever that, it kind of becomes like punching a hole in your drinking straw and then trying to suck your water up through the straw with a hole in it or let it go back down. And so once that tree is what we call girdled, they fed around a significant portion of it, it just really weakens the tree. The tree really has no way to recover from it. And those injuries are a lifetime injury, and it can lead to death. And in small little twiggy things like shrubs, the size of your finger, so a lot of times rabbits will just nip those off of the ground, and then that plant has to sprout back up. Now, at least that plant can recover, but the trees, once that lifeline, that trunk's damaged, it's a lifelong damage.
Well, then, means of preventing that from happening, Dennis, one would be putting up some sort of barrier between rodent and tree or shrub. There are several options here.
Yep. To me, what I call a physical barrier to keep them out is probably your best bet. And so this is where the old chicken wire or some sort of mesh wire comes into play. And what you're really doing then is making a fence, a cone, so to speak, around that. And then don't put it sometimes right on the trunk because they can get their little teeth through that openings in the wire. But maybe make a foot circle or so out around the trunk or the base of the plant, and then be sure to tack that down with some wire or a stake, because here again, the wind can blow it over, those type of things. They can push it over. The other thing you got to be careful of in areas where high snowfall, if you don't get it 2 foot high, you get a 6 inch snow, they jump on the top of it and get up higher. So I just use a roll of chicken wire and just make rolls, a big circle around it, and put a piece of rebar in it, a plant stake, something to hold in place. And I do that in the fall when the plants drop their leaves, and then I don't take them off until, everything's leaf fully out in the spring, or you could leave them on there permanently if you want to also. You can also use the corrugated drain pipe also. You can drop those down around, slit them, and put them around trunks of trees also is another great way to prevent the tree from having some damage too.
In addition to or in substitution for those barriers, can repellents be of assistance in any way here?
I'm not a big fan of repellents. The problem with repellents are they either work by taste or smell. And with snow, rain, time, they wear off their effectiveness. They're not as powerful. And so if you're not out there reapplying quickly enough and that barrier, so to speak, breaks down, then that plant's potentially going to be exposed. So I'd rather do some sort of physical barrier than I would rely on repellents. But, if you don't want to do that, just make sure you apply often to make sure those are protected during the entire winter months.
Another thing that we might visit about in protecting these landscape or fruit trees, not anything to do necessarily with rodent feeding, but with the environment itself. Some trees can be vulnerable, Dennis, we're often reminded, to sunscald in the wintertime.
Yeah, so sunscald happens on, here again, these younger trees that have this very light, tan, gray-colored bark. And what happens is that bark, the water, the moisture freezes, and then you get a hot sun, well, not a hot sun, but those rays of the sun coming down in the winter months when it's cold and frozen, and that light-colored bark absorbs that heat of the sun very quickly. And it doesn't give time for that water to melt properly, and it causes the cells to rupture. And you get this, what we call sunscald crack, usually on the southwest side of the plant. Sometimes people call it southwest disease. It's long, vertical, and causes the damage. And here again, kind of like the rabbit damage, once that happens to the trunk, there's really no good way to repair it. Rot, decay sets in. So a lot of times we'll here again go back to the corrugated drain pipe we talked about a minute ago. Slipping that around the young trunk, wrapping it with a tree wrap material. There's a paper product out there. There's now some fibrous type products out there that here again, what it does is it shades the trunk of the tree from that exchange of the sun rays, and it protects it. Fruit trees, a lot of times you'll see where they whitewashed, taken a thin latex white paint and painted the trunk of the trees with a whitewash. Here again, to kind of stop that quick freezing thawing cycle that causes the sunscald.
And some trees are more vulnerable to that freeze thaw than others, aren't they?
Yeah. Here again, peach trees, no matter their age, they tend to be pretty susceptible. Young apple trees also. In the landscape, at least up here in Johnson County, probably all the maple species at an early age are highly susceptible, especially probably the most commonly planted shade tree now is red maple, probably in the state of Kansas. And that one's highly susceptible to sunscald. So if you got a tree there that's probably 3, 5, 6, 7 years or age or less, that's definitely one I would go in and do some winter protection for. Or here again, until it starts getting that, as I talked earlier about, that more thicky, corky, darker colored bark that's more textured, that tends to be less susceptible to the damage then.
All of these are relatively simple steps in protecting our landscape ornamentals from wintertime damage. And to remind, your local extension office has ample materials on conducting all of these steps. So tap into that good information also online at the K-State Horticulture website. Dennis, many thanks.
Thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate being on today.
He's Dennis Patton, Johnson County Extension Horticulture Agent, and he's been featured on this week's Horticulture segment, bringing our Thursday edition to a close. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.